Edward was 62, a humble man who had dedicated more than 2 decades of his life to running a small corner market in a struggling neighborhood just outside Houston. His store was unassuming: rows of canned goods, dusty shelves, the familiar creak of the door that opened to welcome neighbors, regulars, and those in quiet need. It was the kind of place where everyone knew his name, though few knew the weight he carried behind his calm eyes. One late Tuesday afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast long, cold shadows over the cracked sidewalks, the bell above the door jingled softly. A young woman entered, her face drawn and tired, the lines of worry etched deep from sleepless nights and hard days. 2 small children clung to her sides, their clothes patched in places and threadbare at the edges. Their eyes told stories that words never could, of hunger, of fear, but also of fierce, stubborn hope. She moved slowly down the aisles, picking up the bare essentials: a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, a handful of fruit. Each item she held seemed weighed with careful consideration, her fingers trembling slightly as she counted the small collection of coins she clutched in her palm. At the register, the total amount appeared on the screen: $24.63. She paused, biting her lip, hands shaking, then lowered the pile of groceries and said softly, "I only have $18.75. Edward watched her, his heart tightening at the sight of the small girl gripping her little brother's hand, both silently pleading for a miracle they couldn't speak aloud. Without a word, Edward carefully returned the items to the bag, then reached under the counter and added a carton of milk and a package of cookies, treats the children had quietly eyed but didn't dare ask for. "Here," he said quietly, sliding the bag across to her. "Take these home. We have special pricing for families today." The woman's eyes welled with tears, her lips trembling as she tried to refuse. "I can't. You don't have to do this." But Edward only smiled gently, a kindness rooted in years of his own silent battles. "It's nothing," he said simply. She explained, voice breaking, that her husband had recently been discharged from the military and was still searching for work, all while caring for his ailing mother. Edward nodded, understanding far more than she said. Behind them, a man in line scowled and muttered loud enough to be heard, "What is this, a charity? This is a business, not a welfare office." Edward didn't answer, only lowered his eyes and wiped down the counter with steady hands, a quiet shield against the harshness of judgment. The young mother gathered her groceries, whispered a heartfelt thank you, and hurried out into the fading light, clutching her children close. That small moment, humble and unseen by most, was the heart of Edward's world, a world where compassion was a quiet revolution, and where every act of kindness was a seed planted in the soil of hardship. The very next day, the ripple caused by Edward's quiet kindness began to swell into a tide of whispers and pointed glances. What had been an ordinary, almost invisible act of compassion now ignited a blaze of judgment that spread swiftly through the tight-knit community. The video someone had recorded, just a few fleeting seconds at the counter, had found its way onto social media, sparking a wildfire of criticism that caught Edward and his small shop in its merciless grasp. As Edward unlocked his door in the morning, the usual greetings and smiles were replaced by cold stares and hurried steps away from his threshold. Neighbors who had once stopped for a friendly chat now crossed to the opposite side of the street, their eyes averted, their silence deafening. The warmth that had long filled the air of the neighborhood market was replaced by an oppressive chill of suspicion and disapproval. In the aisles, once bustling with familiar faces, there was now an eerie emptiness. The shelves seemed to echo the absence of community, their products gathering dust under the dim fluorescent lights. The small bell above the door rang fewer times each day, and when it did, it was not the sound of friendship. It was a tentative knock, as if visitors were unsure if they belonged. The harshest words came not from strangers, but from those Edward had trusted. A regular customer, standing behind the young mother the day before, did not hide his disdain. His voice, sharp and bitter, cut through the quiet. "What is this now? Running a charity instead of a business? How can you expect to survive when you're giving away your stock to freeloaders?" His words lingered like poison in the air, and a few heads around the store nodded in agreement. Edward met the gaze of the man briefly, his own eyes steady but heavy with weariness. He said nothing because no argument could undo the sting of betrayal, not just of business, but of community trust. The cashier's hands continued their practiced motions, wiping the counter with deliberate care, trying to cleanse not just the surface but the growing stain of judgment. At home that evening, Edward sat alone under the dim glow of a single lamp, scrolling through the flood of comments online. The criticism was relentless, a relentless chorus of voices calling him naive, reckless, even dangerous for his act of generosity. The few who defended him were drowned out by the roar of condemnation. The phrase, "killing honest enterprise," echoed in his mind, a cruel accusation that gnawed at his spirit. Even Mrs. Gonzalez, a long-time customer and once a beacon of quiet support, avoided his shop now. She crossed the street, eyes fixed on the pavement, refusing to meet his gaze. The small gestures of community solidarity, the smiles, the nods, they had vanished, replaced by suspicion and distance. William Harrison, a local business association representative, stopped by one afternoon with a thinly veiled air of condescension. Leaning across the counter, he offered what he called professional advice. His words were sharp, practical, and devoid of warmth. "Edward, this generosity. It's admirable, but it doesn't work anymore. You can't save everyone. It's bad for business, bad for your bottom line. You have to adapt if you want to survive in this economy." Edward listened quietly, placing another item on the shelf, his heart sinking with each word. "I never said I was saving everyone," he replied softly. "I'm just doing what feels right." William shrugged dismissively, tapping the empty aisles as if they were proof of failure. "Markets change, Ed. You need to change with them." As William left, Edward turned up the volume on the old radio behind the counter, letting a slow, melancholy ballad fill the quiet space. The music carried the weight of a man who felt himself slipping through cracks not of his own making, caught between the unforgiving realities of commerce and the stubborn pulse of compassion beating in his chest. The world around him was shifting, and Edward felt the ground beneath his feet tremble. Yet, despite the cold winds of rejection and the looming shadows of financial ruin, his resolve remained quietly unbroken. He was no stranger to hardship, nor to sacrifice. This was simply another battle, fought not with guns or glory, but with the quiet dignity of a man who refused to abandon his humanity. The following days brought a heavy silence over Edward's modest market, a silence that weighed down on every shelf and crept into every corner of the small space he had tended for decades. Where once the chatter of neighbors and the familiar shuffle of footsteps filled the air, now only the faint hum of the flickering fluorescent lights remained, an eerie soundtrack to the dwindling heartbeat of his store. The consequences of his kindness unfolded not only in the harsh judgment from the community but in tangible, crushing ways that threatened the very survival of the place he had built. Deliveries, once punctual and reliable, began to falter. One afternoon, a familiar driver pulled up outside but remained behind the wheel, his face drawn and hesitant as he spoke through the window. "Edward, I'm sorry, but management says we need to delay your order for now," he explained quietly. "They're concerned about the video going around. Worried about the store's image." Edward nodded slowly, the weight of the unseen hand closing around his business pressing down on his shoulders. The driver, sensing his resignation, added quietly, "My father served too. He would have respected what you did." The words, meant to comfort, felt like a fragile tether to a world slipping further away. Inside the shop, the emptiness grew palpable. Aisles that once bore the weight of freshly stocked goods stood barren, the shelves echoing with absence. With fewer goods to sell and fewer customers willing to step inside, Edward found himself rearranging the same few items over and over, like a man marking time in a place slowly fading from life. The register, once a steady rhythm of small transactions, now rang up only the occasional sale. A loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, a handful of fruit. At home, the strain seeped into Edward's quiet sanctuary, a modest apartment just blocks away, where the soft mechanical hum of the laundromat below was a constant reminder of the world's ongoing rhythms, worlds moving on without him. He sat on his balcony, the night wrapping around him like a shroud, staring at the same silver star medal he always carried. His fingers traced the cold metal, each ridge a memory. The desert heat, the faces of comrades, the desperate hours of waiting and hope. The medal was a silent witness to a past he rarely spoke of, but now it felt like the only part of his identity that remained untouched by the growing storm. Despite the hardships, Edward's spirit did not break. There was a quiet dignity in his daily routine, the careful sweeping of floors, the methodical wiping of counters, the soft humming that accompanied him as he arranged his shrinking stock. But beneath that dignity, there was a profound loneliness, a feeling of being misunderstood and abandoned by the very community he had devoted himself to serving. Yet, amidst the isolation, small acts of kindness flickered like fragile candles in the dark. A neighbor left a note of encouragement tucked beneath a door. A few regular customers slipped in quietly to buy essentials without a word of the controversy. These moments, brief and quiet, were Edward's lifelines, proof that not all had turned away, that somewhere beneath the judgment and the whispers, compassion still endured. The struggle was far from over, and the future uncertain. But Edward's story was not one of defeat. It was the story of a man standing firm in the face of adversity, guided by an unwavering commitment to kindness, even when the world around him seemed intent on closing its doors. The market, like Edward himself, remained a quiet testament to the belief that goodness, though often challenged, is never truly lost. Just when the weight of loneliness and rejection seemed unbearable, an unexpected knock at the door shattered the heavy silence that had settled over Edward's world. It was early morning, the faint golden light of dawn spilling softly through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floorboards. Edward opened the door to find two uniformed officers standing solemnly on his doorstep, their expressions a mix of respect and something more profound: recognition. "We are here on behalf of the Army Veterans Association," one of them began, voice steady yet warm. "We've been following the news and wanted to reach out. Your service to the country and your recent actions in the community have not gone unnoticed." The word struck Edward deeply, a rush of emotions flooding his chest, relief, surprise, and a cautious hope he hadn't dared to feel in weeks. They handed him a letter embossed with the official seal, an invitation to a ceremony honoring his military service and his unwavering commitment to humanity. The letter spoke of gratitude, respect, and a promise to stand by those who had stood for their country. For Edward, it was more than just recognition. It was a lifeline, a powerful reminder that he was not invisible, that his sacrifices and his heart still mattered. In the days that followed, the news of the upcoming ceremony spread quietly through the neighborhood. It brought a subtle shift in the air, a rekindling of respect, a thawing of the cold shoulders he had endured. Old customers returned, their faces tinged with newfound admiration rather than suspicion. A local newspaper ran a heartfelt piece about Edward's service and his recent struggles, painting a picture not of failure but of resilience and honor. The ceremony itself was a profound moment, held in the grand hall of the community center, bathed in warm light and filled with the soft murmur of supportive voices. Edward stood at the center, the weight of years pressing on his shoulders, but also the steady strength of a lifetime of service. As the commanding officer read aloud the citation, words that spoke of courage in battle and compassion in peace, Edward felt tears prick the corners of his eyes, a mixture of pride and quiet vindication. After the formalities, many came forward to shake his hand, to offer smiles and stories of their own struggles and hopes. A young veteran barely older than Edward's own son clasped his arm and said, "You remind us why we keep fighting, not just for our country but for each other." In that moment, the walls of isolation that had surrounded Edward began to crumble, replaced by a renewed sense of belonging and purpose. Back at his shop, the changes were tangible. The deliveries resumed without delay, the shelves once again filled with fresh goods, and the once empty aisles buzzed softly with familiar footsteps. But more than the practical, Edward sensed a deeper transformation. The community was healing alongside him, recognizing that kindness and courage could coexist even in the harshest of times. Edward's heart swelled with gratitude, not just for the ceremony or the recognition, but for the enduring power of connection and compassion. He realized that true strength was not measured in trophies or titles, but in the simple acts of caring and standing firm when the world seemed to turn away. The market was no longer just a place to buy and sell. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to resilience, and a living tribute to a man who refused to give up on kindness, no matter the cost. In the weeks that followed the ceremony, the air around Edward's little market began to shimmer with a new kind of warmth, one born not from the summer sun, but from the quiet blossoming of respect and heartfelt appreciation that the community had slowly cultivated. The once empty aisles now thrummed with the soft murmur of conversation and the steady shuffle of footsteps. Faces that had once turned away now smiled with genuine recognition, their eyes reflecting a deepened understanding of the man behind the shopkeeper's apron. Neighbors stopped by more frequently, lingering with kind words and small tokens of gratitude. Freshly baked bread, homegrown vegetables, hand-knit scarves. These gifts, simple in form but profound in meaning, wrapped Edward in an embrace of belonging he had long thought lost. There was Mrs. Langley, the elderly widow who brought a jar of honey from her backyard hive. Her hands trembling slightly as she handed it over, eyes misty with emotion. And young Sam, the local high schooler who had once ignored Edward's greetings, now eagerly volunteered to restock shelves and sweep the floors after school. His admiration unspoken but palpable in every eager movement. The local paper continued to feature Edward's story, shining a light on his decades of service and the grace with which he bore the community's earlier harshness. Letters poured in, not just from locals but from strangers touched by his story. Messages of support, shared experiences of hardship, and heartfelt thanks for reminding them of the power of quiet courage. In his small apartment, Edward would read these letters by the flickering light of a worn lamp, a gentle smile softening the lines of his weathered face. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of deep purple and gold, the community gathered outside the market for an impromptu celebration. String lights twinkled overhead, music floated softly through the air, and the scent of homemade dishes mingled with the cool breeze. Children's laughter danced between the stalls, weaving a tapestry of joy that wrapped around Edward like a long-awaited embrace. It was a celebration not just of one man, but of a collective journey, from misunderstanding to acceptance, from judgment to compassion. Edward stood quietly at the center, his heart swelling with gratitude and a quiet pride that ran deeper than any medal could convey. He saw in the faces around him not just neighbors, but friends, each one a thread in the rich fabric of community he had fought so hard to preserve. The market had become more than a place of business. It was a sanctuary where kindness was traded as freely as goods, where respect and love were the currency that truly mattered. In the days that followed, Edward's steps grew lighter, his spirit buoyed by the knowledge that he was seen, valued, and loved. The scars left by past hardships remained, etched gently into his soul like the soft lines of a well-worn map, reminders of the journey, not shackles to hold him back. And as he opened the doors each morning, greeted by familiar smiles and heartfelt hellos, Edward knew that in the heart of this small community, he had found something far more enduring than recognition. He had found a home. ChatGPT said. As the evening sun dipped low, casting a gentle amber glow over the quiet neighborhood, Edward stood once more behind his worn counter, the familiar creak of the wooden floor beneath his feet a comforting echo of decades past. His eyes, though lined with the marks of time and hardship, shone with a newfound light, a blend of quiet pride, humility, and unshakable resolve. Around him, the market buzzed softly with the life of a community that had weathered storms together and emerged stronger, bound by something far greater than mere transactions. Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out the small silver star, the same one he had carried through battlefields and lonely nights, through doubt and sacrifice. Now it gleamed softly in the fading light, a symbol not just of bravery on distant sands, but of compassion in the everyday struggles faced by those who walked through his doors. He traced its edges thoughtfully, his mind weaving through memories both bitter and sweet, comrades lost, moments of fear, acts of kindness exchanged in silence. His heart swelled with the deep truth he had come to live by. True courage was not always loud or heralded. It lived in quiet acts of grace, in extending a hand when the world turns its back, in choosing hope when despair seems easier. Edward's story, now shared beyond his little corner market, was a testament to the power of kindness, not as a transaction, but as a lifeline thrown in the dark, a gentle defiance against indifference. He glanced out the window at the faces passing by. Neighbors who had once doubted now smiling with genuine warmth, children whose laughter filled the air like music, strangers who had come to witness the ripple effect of a single act of generosity. This was the legacy he hoped to leave. A reminder that each of us holds within our grasp the power to change a life, to rebuild a community, to heal invisible wounds. Edward's voice, steady and soft, carried through the quiet room as he spoke to no one and everyone at once. In a world that often forgets to care, remember this: compassion is never wasted. It returns in ways unseen, in echoes of hope and courage that outlast us all. Stand firm in kindness, for it is the truest measure of our humanity. The silver star rested now on the counter, catching the last rays of sunlight, a beacon for those who understood that heroism wears many faces, and sometimes the greatest battles are fought with a heart open wide. Edward smiled gently, a quiet peace settling over him as the day gave way to night, and the world held its breath in reverence for a humble man whose kindness had become a light in the darkness.